So hello, my name is Eugene. I work for Magento for last, I think, 3 years, and this year I joined the community engineering team. So now I'm also a core maintainer. Yeah, I'm proud of it. I really like it. And today I'd like to talk about a topic which may be relevant to anyone, like integrators, customizers, maybe some extension developers, and the most beneficial for core developers, actually. So I'll show which guidelines we use internally for our code, specifically the new code. So this all started a few years ago with the initiative by Magento's Architectural Council, and the architects came up with the idea that we have to document all the approaches which we use and use it for further code review and quality checks and etc. So document been in development and discussion and work for more than a year. And after a year, actually, it was released. It's now even released in public. In public, it's available on the Magento Dev Docs. There is a link, but it's easy to find anyway. So what is this? It's a guide which contains a lot of information, but it's all given in the context of rules. So it only looks like rules. This is why I've picked some of those, and we'll try to explain some of those maybe closer. Yeah, so we'll start with the really basic stuff, because it's going to get some techy, so maybe we'll start with simple. So starting with the Magento 2.2, we decided to drop support of PHP 5.6, and well, main reason was the performance, but still a really nice feature of the strict types, which still is not like in Java or other languages, but still it gives you flexibility. It gives you more room to find your bugs on the stage of development. Right away, you will see that standards are not met, and you have to change the code. So new rules enforce all new code which we develop for Magento 2.2 and later to include type hinting and to use return types. Yeah, we're trying to move slightly a bit away from that picture, but I guess we'll get there at some point. Actually, in PHP 7.1, they added even some more return types, like void, which is not supported yet, but we'll get there. So yeah, that was like the basic. And the class design, it's the biggest chapter of the document, actually. And I will also start with the easiest thing that everyone, I guess, knows already because of Ben and his famous stickers. And it's Object Manager. So yeah, we'll say this like millions time again, but do not use Object Manager. Do not inject it in your class. You will suffer from that later, or somebody who would like to extend your code, to modify your code, will have huge trouble. So, oh, it's too small, but still it's not that relevant. So what's happening here, it's just a small example of a class which just used a logger, which it's obtained from the Object Manager directly. And actually, only way to change that logger from the whichever default logger that is to like some email, SMS, doesn't matter, would be to completely rewrite this, which is like stupid, consumes a lot of time. So much better to use the dependency injection, constructor injection, and at this point you just provide interface, and then you can configure which class implementing that interface will work. So yeah, that's basic. And the next one, maybe someone didn't yet know, because we always say that Object Manager shouldn't be used, but actually I have some use cases where you should use Object Manager. For instance, you're working on some class which should produce objects. And this is, Object Manager is a perfect idea to use. This is what we use. If somebody encounters some use case where developer needs a factory or a builder and it doesn't meet, like Magento's auto-generated factories doesn't meet his needs, it's perfectly fine to inject object manager and to construct the classes which you would like. The other use case, actually, which we use quite a lot now, we use static calls to object manager specifically to maintain backwards compatibility. So actually, we're violating two of our own rules because we tend not to use static calls and we tend not to use object manager, but still we have to do it because this is the only known way for us to preserve the at least constructor signatures at this point. So someday we'll refactor all that. If you see it, don't blame us too much. Yeah. So the next point is quite controversial. You may have noticed that Magento, specifically 2.2, and it will happen again, like more rapidly, we are trying to get rid of inheritance. We actually have a lot of developer experience backlog stories aimed at elimination of the layer supertypes, such as abstract block, abstract model. A lot of those methods are, and those classes are even already deprecated. Actually, we have quite a lot of reasons to do that, because basically what comes up to mind that inheritance is usually used as the code reuse mechanism. Well, I mean, there are a lot of other ways you can use it, but still a lot of people just do it that way. So it actually implies some restrictions to your customizability and to extensibility, because when you extend from some class, you cannot change it anymore. You're just stuck with it. Specifically in runtime, or even not in runtime, you have to do some refactoring. So overwriting logic, which uses inheritance as well, sometimes can be quite tricky. And we learned that ourselves when we started to maintain the backwards compatibility. We see a lot of problems which would not be there if we didn't use so much of inheritance in the past. So, it's also a small one, but it's small example, like how could you implement some kind of, let's say, price renderer using extension inheritance. And it would be, you could implement some kind of abstract product price renderer, which would have a method which would format your price. And then you could extend all our other renderers from that. It would be perfectly fine unless you're designing the system to be customizable. By doing so, you eliminate the easy customizability, because any third-party developer who would like to change that would have to re-implement each and every of the price renderer you included. So much better way to do this would be just to use composition. Just create another class which is responsible only for that specific logic, for specific business logic, and use it everywhere you wish. It gives much more space for the customizers, for people who would need to change this behavior, because they could basically just pass another class which would do the same but in different way. So there are some places where you could use inheritance, and sometimes it's you have a system where you have some subtypes and you can see it clearly. But still, anyway, you always have to pay attention to use always the correct abstraction. As we can see, it's like pretty much the same, but at some point it may become apparent that you choose the wrong one, and then you're gonna have to spend a lot of time to fix that as well. So yeah, next one, also what we try to do, since we're doing composition, we're trying to decompose all the classes into really small objects, small classes, which have only one single responsibility. This is the reason for the fact that you can find a lot of classes with one method in Magento, and with like 1 or 2 dependencies even. A lot of new code is developed that way. And actually, usually it simplifies testing, both unit and integration. It allows for easy replacement of anything. So just swap out the dependency and that's it. So, and yes, it also really useful for any third parties who would like to change the code, change the behavior. So yeah, proceeding with the objects, with the class design, one of the points we mentioned in the technical guide, in the technical guidelines, is that all objects must be ready to use like as soon as they are created. We do not encourage any kind of logic, any kind of business logic, or even any kind of initialization in the constructor. This is because sometimes it can cause some unpredictable results. For instance, your initialize method could throw some kind of random exception which is not expected anywhere. So it is best to isolate all that stuff and to keep only dependency assignment operation in the constructor. And well, who knows, maybe someday we'll have auto-generated constructors, so that way would be nice. Yeah, so the next one on the dependency injection, and some highlights in this section would be it is best to always use the most generic type. So if you see there is an interface for some class which you would like to use, it's best to use the interface, because somebody could customize it or swap out for the one with the slightly different behavior. And then this way you're more likely to maintain compatibility with any other extensions. Also, it's not a good idea to request something like plugins or proxies directly in the constructor. There are different mechanisms for that. For example, proxies are best declared in the dependency injection config file. Yeah, another controversial topic. At some point, I think it was already Magento 2.2 in development, we enforced a new rule that all new code should have either public methods and properties or private. Again, a lot of people said that it's very strange for the system that tries to be as extendable as possible to do such things, but actually it's also not a big problem. It actually helps you to maintain a clear and clean contract for every class. Because as soon as you add any protected properties or methods, any other client who could already extend it, inherit, or do anything else with it, will be most likely using it as well, or maybe just requesting or just copying. So why introduce additional contracts to the object if you can just make all that private and decompose into like as small pieces as possible? So yeah. Next one, temporal coupling. You can see that quite a lot in Magento's legacy code. And actually, if somebody is not familiar what temporal coupling is it happens when you have methods which should be called in the specific order to achieve some result. So basically, one of the examples would be a builder, but builder is not as bad as other classes using this approach. So if you see a lot of method chaining, you should always think about which methods and in which order should I call to make it work. So basically, this is the temporal coupling. The topic is quite big, but this link, it has a really nice article from Marco Pivetta. He's actually one of the Zen framework maintainers, so he knows how to do his job properly. It's nice to read. If you didn't read it yet, I suggest doing that. Yeah, next one, the object state. So basically, Magento's specific direction in this question would be to eliminate as much objects, as much classes which have state as possible. Like one of the reasons, at some point in the future, we would consider to become a truly microservice platform or something like that, and all those states would be a trouble in this case. So currently we do not suggest implementing any classes, any object which have any kind of behavior, and they should not have state. This would be much easier to maintain. So currently, only data objects can have observable state. Yeah. And yeah, the last point, I think it's quite obvious, but still, if you get something, you shouldn't change anything, but that happens. So the next one is principle of least knowledge. I think it's also known as a Demetra's law, and it's quite simple. You should never use anything from your dependencies, any other dependencies. So basically, if you have 3 objects, object A shouldn't take anything from object C. It also creates clutter in your code and increases coupling, and you can't properly track all of the dependencies. So if you really need that, it's best to inject object C as well and use it like as a nearest neighbor. Yeah, a small chapter on interception. Actually, interception, I think most of people who use Magento 2 are familiar with that. So it's a mechanism which we also call plugins. And we have before plugins, after plugins, and around plugins. So there are also some guidelines. Specifically, plugins must be stateless as well, as we talked about earlier. This is at least because a single plugin may be called a few times during execution, so it wouldn't be nice to see it in some dirty state. You shouldn't pluginize the data object, and it's not really a good idea to use plugins inside the module where the plugin is. Sometimes that happens as well, but it's really discouraged because usually instead of that you could just change your logic accordingly. That's it. Also, I suggest to look for other ways to customize any behavior than adding a plugin, because sometimes you can see some maybe SPI interface which you could use, or some other extension point, maybe inject something somewhere in the constructor instead of plugin, and that could save you at least some performance and some debugging time. So it's also nice. And specific slide about round plugins. These are, well, we do not encourage people to use these. Specifically, they should be used only in the case where at some point original method should not be called at all. This is actually, I think, only a valid reason now to use it. Well, there may be some exceptions, but anyway. What we found that performance suffers a lot from the round plugins because it has a really lot of calls compared to other types. And additionally, it's really a nightmare to debug. If someone tried to debug a round plugin, it's not fun. At some point you learn how to do that, but still it's useless. Yeah, so a few slides on the exception handling. So the main idea in which we have in the technical guidelines regarding the exceptions handling is that you shouldn't build your domain logic or business logic, or to be honest, any kind of logic on the exceptions, because, well, PHP provides really nice conditional, like it's possible to do if, switch, any other stuff. So why use exceptions for that? But we had to mention that because sometimes we see that even in core code. So yeah, it's found its place in the guidelines. So another point which we are enforcing a lot now in the core is that as long as you introduce any third-party dependency to your system, maybe it's some kind of different library or integration with any kind of third-party service, maybe some CDN, I don't know, anything that is outside of your code, it's best to wrap anything of that in try catches, and it's really good idea to implement adapters for all of the stuff. Because you never know what could happen, so when communicating with all the third parties, you always have to check if everything is fine, and if it's not, provides a good fail-safe way to resume normal operation. So yeah. And the next point, it's a good idea to log exceptions. Actually, we even had some developer experience stories in core backlog regarding the modification of exception catches, because we didn't have as much logging as we need to. And we're working on that. We're still working on that, and suggest other people do that too, because at some point it may save you a really lot of time. So yeah, a short chapter on application layers. I will not go too deep into this, but basically we could, I think, split Magento into 3 big layers. First one, which you would encounter, is a presentation layer. Basically, this is all what the user interacts with. So it may be controllers, maybe some kind of blocks, layouts, UI components, anything that has anything to do with user interaction and presentation of the actual page, actual result of any actions. So currently, core Magento tends to implement small controllers, some really slim controllers which would just pass the execution to other layers, for instance, to service layer. And this is a good idea because it's much easier to maintain, because you never know what could happen in that controller. Also, controller could only throw, if that happens, only localized exceptions, because currently in Magento it's the only type of exception which would be translated into user's native language. And actually this is the exception which would be presented to the end user. So it's not a good idea to throw that kind of exception from, let's say, service layer, because, well, it may get translated again, for example, or may not get translated at all. So service layer is a really big part, so just a few points. Basically, what service layer, like in its current state is, it's a contract for each module. It's an API which you can use, and also it's modules web API in most of the cases. And actually another use case for that is SPI, which is service provider interface. So any API interface, the one you see in the modules API namespace, may be used as SPI as well, by simply providing your own implementation for that interface. That may be useful at some points. Maybe somebody would like to rewrite any behavior of the module completely. This is possible using SPI. The only drawback is that if you start using any interface as SPI, you have to depend not on the major but on the minor version of the module, because, well, it may get broken by some kind of future update. Also, service contracts, service layer, all of that should follow CQRS principle. Actually, a few presentations ago, my colleague Valery was talking about CQRS more. So basically, you should separate read and write operations. It would be beneficial to you at some point. And the last one, but not the least, it's persistence layer. Persistence layer should only perform the operations which directly persist any data. So it's not a good idea to persist anything from the model. This is the reason, actually, one of the reasons why abstract model save is currently deprecated. So resource model should be used instead, and for every persistence operation, specific class should be used for that, because at some point somebody could decide to swap out the default storage for another one, maybe some other database for some component, I don't know, but there are really a lot of scenarios. So it's best to keep the data and the logic in one place and persist it in the different place, which can be easily changed. Some points on the scopes as well. You can see that's already in Magento quite a lot. So we have scopes for some entities like products, for categories, for EAV. So the scopes may be like website or I don't know, store view, anything. And what we suggest is to persist only one scope set at a time, because, well, it will save you trouble as well. But to be honest, that's it from me. I've tried to be as short as possible because, well, it's soon party time. Yeah, so I don't want to waste your time. So if you have any questions, please ask now, or you can reach me anytime later.
Thank you. Yep.
Oh, I see I'm in trouble.
No, you're not in trouble. So my question is about time coupling, because I agree, I totally agree with you that time coupling is probably one of the most messing thing in coding. But what I'm asking is, how can you, for example, handle the product controller? It's just an example in which, for example, you set a registry key that you recalled afterwards. This is a kind of time coupling, in my opinion. So how can you rearrange this?
Well, sometimes you can't fix that. Like, if you have some examples, that may be possible, but it's more like guidelines which suggest you how to design stuff. So that would not happen in the future. So regarding the specific scenario you asked about, to be honest, I guess I could provide some better answer if I could take a look at the code, because it's quite hard to me just to imagine all the stuff and say how to do that.
Yeah, that's good.
So if you wish, we could talk later after this, maybe discuss some ways.
Okay, that's fine. Thank you.
Thank you.
First of all, thank you for this nice presentation.
Thank you.
It seemed all pretty clear, but as we all know, what you presented here is not covered 100% in the core. I mean, there are still things that do exactly the opposite of what you presented.
Yes.
And fixing those will break backwards compatibility for some modules, because there's no other way to do it, I assume. What are your priorities? Are you going to implement these standards everywhere, or keeping backwards compatibility takes priority over fixing everything?
Well, our priority would be to maintain backwards compatibility as much as possible, but some specific cases could be refactored, causing too much trouble for third parties. And this is more aimed at the new code, the code which we writing now, implementing now. So one of the modules which you could see most of those principles in action is multi-source inventory, which my colleague presented. It's like most of it follows these guidelines completely. What we do, we also enforce some of these rules with the static tests, which are executed on each and every pull request. I mean, internal and external, it doesn't matter. So yeah, it's more a work for the future and attempt to have a system without too bad legacy code at some point. That's it.
Thank you.
It may be a scary thought, but technically, backwards compatibility, where we have hard and fast rules around backwards compatibility is with like API, SPI. So think about the things that are noted in the core, especially with API, and anything else could be technically considered as sort of private implementation detail, which of course raises the specter that there's not really sufficient coverage yet. But the community can really help us out here. I will buy each one of you a damned elephant, for sure.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you guys.
Thank you very much. Big round of applause, please.